So I'm going to be away for the next couple of weeks coming up, and I'm not going to be able to produce any videos, so I thought I'd put together this little compilation of anime recommendations. I've made loads of videos in the past recommending different anime, and I'm sure a lot of people haven't watched even a few of them, so I thought I'd put all the best ones into a big compilation video that anybody can sit and watch. And in the bottom corner I've put what video it's from, just to give a little bit of context of what I'm talking about, but they're all basically lists recommending anime, so hopefully it's a good little thing if you're looking for a new anime to watch or just want to hear me talking about various anime. But yeah, please do enjoy. Zegapain is probably the most underappreciated anime series I've ever seen. I rarely hear the mention of the series despite having one of the most impressive and innovative narratives in the medium. Its lack of popularity is a testament to the success of the story. Without giving away too much about the series, it strives to turn all your expectations and judgments on their head. Achieved by doing, well, you'll have to watch the series to find that out. It takes what you would normally expect from a story and flies in the opposite direction, not only telling a fascinating and unique narrative, but actively engaging the viewer to think and question what they're watching. I certainly felt like I was a part of Zegapain rather than just an observer. I felt genuinely effective, a kind of existential narrative. Hyuga Mono is possibly the best aesthetic experience in anime, and I mean that in both a narrative and a visual sense. Riding the wave of the glorious philosophical content of the Sengoku period, Hyuga Mono delves deep into its themes of imperfection while beautifully capturing the atmosphere of its time, and on top of its many thematic layers lies a fantastic sprawling narrative involving a plethora of expertly written and perfectly developed characters. With gorgeous consideration for its own aesthetic and poetically illustrative narrative, Hyuga Mono is one of the most underappreciated series of the decade. Angel's Egg is a piece that really shouldn't exist. Back in the early 80s, Mamoru Oshii was brought in to make a Lupin the Third movie. Unfortunately, the production failed, and not wanting to waste what had been started, Oshii was left to finish the project. Thus, Angel's Egg was created. A piece that delved deeper into the abstract than any anime had done before, so much so that people are still baffled by its obscurity today, brushed aside by many who believe its comprehension just to be unreachable. It's filled with fantastically evocative imagery, symbolising beautifully the simple story it's telling. The narrative is about belief and faith. Oshii utilises his surreal and interpretive storytelling style to mirror this narrative theme. You take the role of the main character as you yourself toy with your own interpretation of the movie. It forces you to ponder your own experience and ask questions. It's an incredibly fascinating and evocative piece. Horizon in the Middle of Nowhere is at first look, and even at first watch, a complicated experience, of which its qualities are buried under a landscape of busyness. Its myriad of genres are wrapped in its crazy sci-fi fantasy aesthetic. Everything is exaggerated into the absurd, but it balances that absurdity to a degree that introduces harmony within its elements. The comedy works with the adventure that helps rationalise the action, all while maintaining a meaningful romance. The sci-fi and fantasy elements are integrated nicely without feeling too convoluted or overcomplicated. Definitely worth a watch for fans of any genre. War in the Pocket is a real gem in the vast Gundam landscape. Unlike many of the franchise's other installments, it's modest in both its size and its focus, but certainly not its impact. The short series approaches its viewer as a more simple piece, which pays off when the series evolves its complexity in the future episodes. Focusing on smaller aspects of the world, War in the Pocket allows itself to tackle very real issues. Watching the effects of war on ordinary, sometimes naive people can be just as, if not more effective than focusing on the soldiers themselves. We can really connect to the situation as it's one similar to our position as a viewer. The use of subtle but effective storytelling is an achievement hard to accomplish, but glorious in its effects. Den Coil is a prime example of accomplished imagery, story progression and theme implementation. It tells a beautiful story, simple but bearing complex fruit. I found the story's ability to show so little yet express so much absolutely captivating, allowing the viewer time to ponder, letting their experience blossom. This placid style of storytelling also allows the seamless integration of the philosophical and topical sci-fi themes, explored in engaging fashion as the series progresses. Terra E shares a common aesthetic with many other space operas. It's quite easy to brush off immediately, but the series conquers so many of its thematic opponents throughout its 24-episode duration. Adopted from a classic 80s space opera manga, it drinks from the same pond as a multitude of the medium's greats. With an abundance of ambition and scope, Terra E sets itself up beyond what one would expect. But with impressive handling of its diverse and conflicting themes, it wraps its world in lore and immersion, creating a series full of adventure and depth. Kaiji is a thrilling psychological series, filled with tension and absurdity. Unlike many sports and game shows, Kaiji is less about the actual game they're playing, and more around the actions and consequences of that game, seeing how human psychology acts at its most strained. The reactions and behaviour of Kaiji's characters are remarkably believable, although pushed well past the realm of our own experience. I think this is where the series really flourishes. The level of immersion for such ludicrousy is entertainment at its best. Pushed into obscurity by Abbey's other works, Naya Under 7 gets very little recognition. Missing many of the genres Abbey normally injects into his work, it's not as smooth a transition for fans to make. Being more of a comedy slice of life, you wouldn't expect it to be much more than a testing ground for Abbey's future pieces, but Naya Under 7 is actually a very nice, self-contained series. Just imagine Abbey's bizarre philosophical style looked at through a comedic lens. It doesn't set its bars too high, but has a very unique and entertaining approach to the comedy genre. And it's not void of the thought-provoking content we're used to. It carries and subtly explores its themes throughout the show, definitely one that deserves more credit than it currently receives. House of Five Leaves is a fascinating piece that, like Hyogemono, calls upon a past time to help tell its story in a unique fashion. Using the samurai as its subject, it focuses not on the violence, but the morals and psychology of its time. It's a very quiet series, studying on a small group of characters and relying on subtle actions to tell their story. It does so gorgeously, attaching you to the characters without being too intrusive. I once again loved how it captured the feel of the era, showing believable aspects of its society and certain individuals within. It's very effective and beautifully molds together. Super Dimension Fortress Macross, and yes, it is as epic as the name suggests. It started in the early 80s around the same time Gundam was taking off, and space operas in general were becoming one of the industry's hottest exports. Now this would normally calculate a recipe for repetition. Normally popularity sparks formulas, but Macross has a lot more maturity and ambition than one would expect. With a very well written story, interesting characters and an imaginative scale, Macross goes the extra mile over its space opera brethren. With some production hiccups and some writing problems, it does come with its downsides, but I think it's a really solid product overall. Skip 20 years into the future and you see the fruit sprouting from the seeds of Macross's era, Eureka 7 being one of the best. It's everything the 80s mecha series gave us, only injected with a large dose of colour and flair. And it's packed with everything that makes the 21st century mecha show awesome. It's bright, it's loud, and it's really solid. With fantastic production and a really warm story, it's one of the decade's most enjoyable and rewarding shows. Its sci-fi elements are a lot more exaggerated than some other shows, but the believable world you get inserted into makes it all come to life spectacularly. Metropolis has similar heritage. The 2001 film is a reimagining of Osamu Tezuka's 1949 manga, using similar classic aesthetics. Not only does it take on the classic look, but it completely absorbs itself in that atmosphere. Everything from the background art to the soundtrack feels really authentic. My favourite parts about the film were definitely its visuals, but that's not to say the narrative isn't worth mentioning. It does have a rather basic premise that invites criticism, but I personally think the well-structured and paced execution more than makes up for it. For me, the feeling of scale and immersion created by the film's visuals is reason enough to watch this one. Ergo Proxy is a personal favourite of mine. Its deeply philosophical undertones and epic dystopian setting make it one of the most unique anime series out there. It's quite easily one of the best uses of a science fiction premise I've ever watched. Thematically, it offers everything, from politics to psychology, exploring everything with a fantastic sense of subtlety that doesn't negatively affect the narrative. All of this combined with a brilliant art style and a really intricate world design makes Ergo Proxy one of my favourites from the genre. Ergo Proxy preferred the mysterious and the unknown values that the world brought by leaving out explanations in certain parts of the lore. Terra E, on the other hand, prefers to really immerse its viewer into the politics and history of its universe. I think this is one of the best space operas out there, which is impressive considering it's only 20 odd episodes. Based off a manga from the heyday of space operas, Terra E retains many of the classic values while evolving a modern day touch. It addresses a vast plane of content without feeling too rushed. Its fantastic writing really allowed it to broaden its horizon, covering a large time span and colossal amount of narrative content, all tucked together with a really nice visual wrapping. Legend of the Galactic Heroes carries even more ambition, and with 110 episodes to work with, is easily one of the grandest pieces out there. The way this series approaches sci-fi is fantastic. Although it's full of space wars and planet guns, it all feels completely real, as if the series is merely a look into the future. This is instrumental in immersing you into the series. I think anybody would have a hard time finding a series that tackled so much with such a high success rate, creating a colossal universe filled with politics and history. Truly one of the best sci-fi works available. Royal Space Force is certainly less ambitious in its focus. Instead of telling the story of generals at war, it tells the story of a group of rather insignificant people. Though that's not to say the movie falls short. In fact, the movie's interesting writing makes it incredibly touching. What makes this movie so memorable is its groundbreaking visuals. The detail and production of this film never fails to impress. It's such a unique story told in a really smart way. Visually represented fantastically, it's really one of the best sci-fi films out there. Like many of the entries on this list, Space Battleship Yamato 2199 is a reimagining of a classic. And once again, it's a space opera. Yamato doesn't hold back in really capturing that classic feeling. If you like massive space battles full of lasers and drama, then this is the one for you. It also manages to produce a really awesome narrative. It takes a classic story, irons it out and condenses it into one series. Definitely a must watch if you're a fan of classic sci-fi or modern sci-fi. Even though Jikan is a big tone change from the rest of the list. Instead of massive space wars, it's full of conversations and cafes. Despite this more mellow premise, it's by far one of the most unique and interesting sci-fi anime out there. It does a number of things really well. It's gorgeously put together. Everything from the soundtrack to the scene pacing fits really well. It has very suitably written characters. They interact fantastically and make it a real joy to watch. And finally, it implements the sci-fi elements perfectly. With really subtle writing, it creates a great story that addresses futuristic plot points but feels completely real. Definitely a welcome change to the genre. Gunbuster is a short OVA series that has a much bigger influence on modern anime than you might think. At first glance it doesn't look too ambitious, but it's one of the early examples of what anime would become. These days the animation might not hold up as well, but the story and art holds up brilliantly. I'd urge everyone to go watch this and then go on to see how much modern anime takes from it. A brilliant point in anime's evolution. The first short I'm going to be talking about is Furiko. This style of short comes up quite a lot, but Furiko is by far the most powerful. It's always better to have a successful, simple idea than an unsuccessful, overcomplicated idea. Some shows and movies try to squeeze in as much content as possible, and this ends up giving them no time to make any of that content any good. They just have a bunch of undeveloped pieces to the puzzle. Furiko, on the other hand, focuses on a few vital points and nails them. The art style is simple, the story is simple, but it's easily one of the most powerful pieces of animation I've ever watched. It fires through the life of a couple, highlighting very quickly the major points in their lives. And that's all it needs. It only takes a few seconds to explain each plot point. They use a swinging pendulum to show the passing of time. This way they could naturally pass through the time to great effect. The short creates such an attachment to the viewer in such a short time while being so minimalistic. It's easily one of my favourite shorts. The next one is a short made by Osamu Tezuka in 1984. This extremely simple piece is one of the most interesting shorts out there. It doesn't have much of a narrative or really any characters. It just follows someone as they jump up and down, progressively getting higher and travelling greater distances. Other than how awesome it feels to jump to such heights, the short is an enjoyable experience because of its nature. Tezuka very quickly shows us little snippets of people's lives. We land into someone's life for just a brief second and leave. It's such a simple idea that it works brilliantly. With an element of humour, jumping is one of the most enjoyable and interesting shorts on the list. The majority of people watching this video will have watched or heard about The Matrix. It's a very famous and iconic sci-fi movie trilogy, but what people are less aware of is the Animatrix, a collection of short films that explain some of the Matrix lore, sometimes actually explaining it better than the films do. Big names like Shinichiro Watanabe and Koji Muramoto were brought in to create some of these films, and it really shows. While some of the shorts feel a little bit lackluster, some of them were fantastic. For example, Kid's Story that was produced by Studio 4C. There are some brilliant examples of animation and a number of really great stories. Like I said, some of the content in these shorts does The Matrix better than The Matrix does The Matrix. She and Her Cat is a Makoto Shinkai short, and in my opinion, one of his best told stories. I don't think Shinkai's style lends itself to longer stories. He tells very simple tales that work best as 5-minute shorts. And of course, as usual, his visual style was spectacular. The short was just very well presented, everything from the sound design to the timing of the cuts. It looked great, sounded great, and felt very fluid. Like I said, the story is a very simple one, but it's very effective. Subtle bits of dialogue and the use of random camera focuses allow the story to be told in a very unique way. It confuses the viewer into thinking the story is something it's not. This creates a really great payoff in the end. Shinkai's shorts are all very enjoyable, but She and Her Cat is so well done. Eblard Jikan is a lot less narrative driven than some of the other shorts I've mentioned, but it's still just as engaging. It's a short produced by Studio Ghibli, who brought some of Naohisa Ino's paintings to life. Ino has worked on various Ghibli films in the past as an artist, and this short really shows the depths of his talent and imagination. His work has such style and it's so vibrant, it's hard to take your eyes off them. This short might not have much of a narrative, but it clearly tells a great story through its visuals alone. First up is one of the more recent entries on this list, Kyousou Giga. This show has one of the most dazzling art styles in any anime, and it really uses its style in almost every sense. Everything from the use of colour to the drawing techniques were very Giga. I also love the mixture of both two-dimensional and three-dimensional elements. They came together to both help the narrative and create a real mixture of visual showcases. Kuchu Barranco is a series that feeds off its art style. It actually uses it to tell the stories. It's definitely one of the smartest uses of an art style I've seen from an anime. They use all sorts of cool tricks to help the show along. If something needs visually represented in the show, you can count on it being done with style. It's incredibly vibrant and stylistic, one of the nicest looking art styles out there. I just love how they used everything in the show's creation, from rotoscoping to just using shapes. Every resource available was used to create this wacky show. Humanity Has Declined used this art style to back up its fairy tale atmosphere. It was made to look like a storybook, with soft colours and fluffy designs. It made the slightly sinister story work even more. My favourite part was definitely the use of colour. It was just fantastic in building the world and executing the stories. Angel's Egg is a piece of art, and it holds one of the most unique and well-fitting styles in anime. It's torturous, surreal, confusing. It delves deep into itself, dragging you down into the depths of surrealism with it. Intricate detail and evil colour selection create one of the most distressingly brilliant pieces of animation out there. It really does disconnect you with reality. A piece of phantasmagoria is a solo piece from the mind of Shigeru Tamura, and when I say from the mind, I really mean it. He brings a whole world to life with his collection of short stories. The simplistic style works wonders in making everything feel so real. Of all the anime I've watched, it's definitely one of the most artistic, despite it being fabulously simple. So where others on the list are really simple, Ping Pong is lavishly complex. It creates a really powerful piece, and the art style does so much to really glue everything together. The aesthetic of Ping Pong is really smart, tight, and alive. It moves in a way that other styles just can't do. It brings everything to life that little bit more than other shows do, creating an even more immersive experience. Everything from the background art to the character designs were marvellously done, creating one of the most memorable anime experiences I've had in a very long time. So The House of Five Leaves is a mysterious show, such is its art style. It's very simplistic in a way that's actually quite complex. They use very repetitive colours and slightly creepy character designs to give the show an odd feeling. The whole show feels a little off, in the best possible way. It deals a lot with the unstable mental state of its main character, and the art style portrays this with unmatchable technique. This one is very subtle but equally impressive. Due to being a movie, Tekken Concrete had extra resources to play around with its style. At its core, it's a rather simple movie, but its ambitious art style elevates it above most other anime movies, turning something very simple into a lagoon of stylistic thought. I thoroughly enjoyed the dynamic shots and the busy compositions this movie gifted me, all thanks to the superb art style. Fooly Cooly is wacky, and its art style says this in bold writing. The style stands alongside very few. It's over the top but maintains a level of reality. It's surreal but also speaks with a simple tongue. It complements the show's interpretive personality by being just as sporadic. So Kaiji isn't as extravagant as the others, but it's just as interesting. It's all about high-stake moments of drama, and the art style supplemented this with the needed exaggeration. Due to its slightly cartoonish basis, it allows gestures to be as subtle or obnoxious as they want to be without feeling too forced. At first glance it looks too comical to be taken seriously, but as you watch it you realise how perfect it is for the show. So that's my list of 10 glorious anime art styles. And of course there are many other fantastic anime art styles. If you have one that you want to suggest, please post it in the comments. Remember, if you enjoyed this video, please do consider clicking the like button, sharing it around and subscribing. Anyway, thank you very much for watching this video. At number 10 is Evangelion. I'm including both the series and end of Evangelion. Eva makes the number 10 spot because of its outstanding job at handling unimaginably complex characters and an incredibly layered script with a reasonable amount of subtlety. It manages to present itself in a much more structured way than any other series could have. The sheer amount of elements to Eva would normally be a recipe for disaster, but they managed to grab that, control it, and create one of the greatest shows of all time. Its characters are the show's strongest point. There isn't a single character in the series whose writing didn't impress me. To fit all of this into an also complex script and maintain a fair level of structure was brilliant. Very few, if not none of the shows to follow Eva could have come close to replicating it. Kaiba is number 9 on the list. This made it onto the list for multiple reasons, the main being its ability to create something so unique and still make it amazing. Despite its quirky art style, Kaiba can easily stand beside all of the greats of sci-fi. The unique atmosphere created by the great art and world design just elevate the already great series. And even without the art, it's still a superbly written series. It's easy to let the art overshadow the writing, but Kaiba still has an amazingly put together story and some really awesome characters. The characters had so much room to develop and show their depth because of the ever-changing world. It allowed them to really explore themselves and show everything to the viewer. Number 8 is the Tatami Galaxy, similar to Kaiba in that its complex and diverse world opens up the characters. It even takes a step further by going even more into depth into the characters. This series is amazing for so many reasons. It's hard to pick a main reason. On one hand, you have this fantastic cast of characters who are all really well written into the brilliant story, creating over time one of the most complex series out there. And on the other hand, you have this insanely gorgeous visual representation. It's a series that all ties together beautifully, in a narrative sense and an aesthetic sense. Everything from the soundtrack to the colour palettes of the scenes, they all come together to make one of the most solid anime series out there. Number 7 on the list is Ergo Proxy. This series just done so much right, the atmosphere being its main strength. It creates this really mysterious world with really well presented themes and questions. The series then takes the approach of meandering through all these themes to create some of the greatest episodes of anime I've ever watched. The series is so underappreciated in its execution of all the complex and tricky elements it brings up. It is not hard to bring up so many complex philosophical themes and address them without the series being a complete mess. It manages to maintain a really strong narrative throughout the show, even stopping at points to create some slower episodes. That is very impressive. This series is one of the best examples of how to do unconventional stories in an unconventional way. Number 6 on the list shows us the beauty of subtlety. One of the absolute best uses of subtlety, Haibane Renmei. This show is simply amazing. Everything it touches turns out perfectly. The atmosphere, the characters, the world, the pacing, it's all amazing. I've seen very few shows successfully pull this level of perfect writing. Shows like this do sometimes run the risk of lacking ambition. Sometimes a show can be flawless, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's good. Addressing a smaller amount of things can be risky, but Renmei is an amazing example of how to do that. It's all in the atmosphere and feeling of the show. It's all down to how immersed the viewer is, which is a product of things like writing and pacing, things that Haibane Renmei does to a T. Starting off the top 5 is Technolize. Man, what a powerful series. Technolize is a great mixture of the more complex shows I mentioned and the simpler ones. It has very well explored themes, but also has an amazing atmosphere created by the show's contrast of complexities. It creates this world that in some ways is very big in scale, yet creates such a melancholic, confined feeling. This is again something that is very overlooked, but it's not an easy thing to do at all. I can count on one hand the shows that create an atmosphere to the same success as Technolize. Technolize is best described as poetic. It's something that I would urge everybody to try out. I've watched it multiple times and it never fails to capture me. Aria. Just Aria. I literally have nothing negative to say. In fact, it's very hard to think of things to say. Aria is one of the most inexplainably great pieces of art I've ever experienced. The series is a journey more immersive than any other anime, more atmospheric, more peaceful. The series has everything. It's 2 amazing seasons and a 3rd season that I can only describe as a masterpiece. The emotion, attachment and bond you feel with the characters in the world are indescribable. All I can say is watch Aria. Experience it yourself. I can say no words that truly represent the show. Number 3 is Ghost in the Shell. Yes, I'm talking about Ghost in the Shell again. Although I'm talking about the movie, I'd also like to include the 2 seasons of standalone Complex. The series holds many of the qualities the movie has, and manages to create its own twists. I definitely have to give both credit for being some of the best written pieces of anime out there. Incredible dialogue addressing some in-depth philosophical topics with such ease. Along with fantastic action, brilliant characters, and one of the best sci-fi worlds ever created to wrap everything up. At number 2 is Mushishi. A series that I've loved for years. I've talked a lot about atmosphere on this list. It's one of my favourite narrative elements, and Mushishi really captures why I love it so much. Create a world of people, landscapes and history that feels real. It's not an easy task, but Mushishi does that brilliantly. It manages to tell some of the best stories I've ever experienced with such subtlety, and in only 20 minutes. That is the glory of Mushishi, its ability to use all of its elements to create a short but compelling story. Which would be impressive to do maybe 5 or 6 times in a series, but Mushishi does it over and over again every single episode. Everything in Mushishi is amazing, it all just works. What I also like about it is how it changes tone from episode to episode. Not only can it tell great stories, but it can switch from dark to playful to serious within minutes. An absolutely fantastic example of great writing and beautiful art combining to create a fantastic series. Now for the creme de la creme of anime. A lot of the series on this list are very close to each other, and could quite easily have switched a position or 2, but Legend of the Galactic Heroes sits comfortably on its throne at the top. Legend of the Galactic Heroes is great because of its sheer scale. It manages to do everything imaginable, and does it better than any other anime has done before. Action, war, romance, politics, philosophy, religion, sci-fi, it does everything like it was no trouble at all. It majestically soars through the ocean of storytelling and emerges a beautiful narrative beast. It's 110 episodes of solid story. No breaks, no shortcuts, it feels like a real slice of history. Neo Tokyo was released back in 1987. It's a collection of short films directed by Rintaro, Yoshiaki Kawajiri and Katsuhiro Otomo. They're all fantastically imaginative works that styles and themes are instantly recognisable in later titles. You can see a bit of everything from the next 2 decades of anime here, both narratively and stylistically. They all offer their own individual style, some being dark and gritty and some being cartoonish. Either way, they mark a fantastic point in anime and in the directors' careers. Each film is under 20 minutes, so there's no excuse to give this one a miss. Armored Trooper Votoms is as badass as it sounds. It's a slightly underappreciated mecha series from the 80s, but it's by far one of the most unique mecha series I've seen. It has all the awesome sci-fi elements you'll love with an extra hint of realism. I'm adding this onto my list because it's such an awesome take on the genre, with a really fantastic classic feel. Imaginative visuals and a really fun cast, Votoms is a real classic. Perfect Blue was released in 1997 and has had massive influence on film and anime. Not only was it one of the most unique psychological anime films out there, but it kickstarted the career of Satoshi Kon, who we all know went on to create even more classics. Few films have come close to matching Perfect Blue's character study, and some of the best written characters still remain in this movie. A really fantastic and unique approach to the subject. Mobile Suit Gundam sits in a similar position to Macross. Although I don't think it achieves the same level of narrative success, it still manages to stay fairly relevant through the years. It's even more impressive when you consider the rocky start the franchise had. Originally created in 1979, it met with very little success and was actually cancelled. Despite this early wobble, it managed to not completely die and was resurrected many years later when a range of Gundam toys became quite successful. Since then, it's gone on to create one of the most successful and universally recognisable brands in anime. Megazone 23 is quite possibly the coolest thing to come out of Japan. It's absolutely jam-packed with everything that makes 80s anime awesome. It's got brilliant character designs, an epic cyberpunk world, a crazy plot, and of course, motorbikes. Similar to many of the other additions to this list, you'll almost immediately see the influence Megazone 23 has had on the anime that followed it. The animation has a fantastic classic look and still holds up today. The sci-fi story definitely itches that scratch that we're missing these days, and the characters have that cheeky charm that brings a really dynamic and interesting drama. Without a doubt, a real classic. Patlabor can be a daunting franchise to watch. There's a lot of different editions from different times with different staff. Although they all have their own reasons to be watched, I'm just going to be talking about Mamoru Oshii's installments. The 7-episode OVA series Early Days and the first 2 movies. I'm doing this because they work nicely as one package, and because they're a massive point in his career. Patlabor to Oshii is very much the godfather to Coppola. It was a success and gave him funding to expand his creative control over future projects. Not only this, but it contains some of his best work. The basic shell of Patlabor allows for the perfect blend of sci-fi and realistic situations, something that lends itself well to Oshii's style. With movie quality animation included, it's become one of my favourites. Cowboy Bebop is arguably the classic. Certainly for us in the West, it's one of the most important series. It came over after its failure in Japan in the early 2000s and was met with a very unexpected response. People loved it, but that wasn't necessarily the already existing anime fans. Bebop captured a more mature audience who'd previously brushed aside the more child-orientated battle shonen. Not only is it incredibly important for us, but it's bloody brilliant. It's one of the best takes on episodic storytelling, creating a completely unique style and atmosphere in every single episode. What I find so compelling about Bebop is its masterful execution of each style. It's not like they just nailed a formula and sprinkled other genres into it. They completely engrossed themselves into other styles perfectly. Cowboy Bebop is a classic that won't be forgotten anytime soon. Great Teacher Onizuka is a real gem that never really gets the credit it deserves, both critically and in its popularity. Sure, the series isn't a pioneer of the medium and there are a number of noticeable problems, but after all these years of watching hundreds of comedy anime, I've watched few that capture the charm and balance as well as Onizuka does. Very rarely does anime get silly comedy right. It always feels repetitive and dull, but that's not the case with Onizuka. The cast, the humour and the cheeky charm of the series all gel together to create a genuinely funny comedy series. When we talk about classic anime, there are few that encapsulate that phrase more than the original space battleship Yamato. It even sounds retro. I normally recommend the remake of this series since it does a fantastic job of modernising the title, but since we're talking specifically about classics, the original is completely necessary. The first movie is a personal favourite of mine, Sword of the Stranger by Studio Bones. The movie didn't get that much attention when it was released in 2007, but don't let that fool you. Sword of the Stranger is a stunningly animated samurai movie about a young boy who's on the run from a group of swordsmen. The movie brings up a lot of really interesting material that you don't see much in samurai movies. It tells the story from the perspective of someone alive at the time. What I mean by this is that the story makes you naive. It makes you believe things that would have been believed back then. You start to forget what you know and start thinking like a person from that time. The best bit about this movie has to be the outstanding animation. The fight scenes are just breathtaking. If nothing else, watch this movie for the action scenes. Millennium Actress by Satoshi Kon is a movie told in an incredibly unique way. Kon throws away the normal narrative structure to create this movie. It's told through an interview with a retired actor. As she tells a story from her past, we literally enter her memories, and I mean literally. The memories merge together with the present day characters, creating a really unique and immersive viewing experience. Paired with great visuals and an awesome soundtrack, Millennium Actress has to be one of my favourite anime films. A definite must watch. Wolf Children is one of the more recent movies on the list. It was released in 2012 and quickly became one of the best titles of the year. It has a really powerful story about a mother trying to raise her children. There are some really emotional scenes and really engaging characters in the movie, not to mention the extremely high quality animation and artwork. Madhouse done a really great job of putting everything together to a very high standard. Perfect Blue is another Kon movie, but this one's a lot darker than Millennium Actress. It follows the dark life of an idol trying to become famous in Japan, and it shows the more sinister side of the business. The way the story is told really makes Perfect Blue stand out. We see the story in the skewed way that our main character sees her life. As the movie goes on, it gets more cryptic. It gets more confusing as the character falls deeper into psychological despair. Though I say it's confusing, it's not impossible to understand or anything. And it's not a bad confusing. I wouldn't just recommend watching this once, but multiple times. Mind Game is an interesting one. Probably the most underappreciated movie on this list. Masaki Yuasa once again creates an impressive piece of work using unconventional story and animation techniques. The story is really fun with a great message, and it has its fair share of both comedic moments and powerful moments. The fact that Yuasa was involved with this should seal the deal already, but if not, then take my recommendation. Mind Game is a brilliantly made movie. All the components come together to create one of the best adventure anime of its decade. To be honest, everyone here should have watched Akira. I don't think many people can argue that Akira is probably the most important anime of all time, especially for the Western industry. It was Japan's most expensive animated movie at the time, and it really shows. Akira has some of the best animation ever produced, even to this day. You can use all the technology in the world for modern anime, but very few come close to looking as amazing as Akira does. The smooth movement, detailed city backgrounds and iconic character designs. Akira is one of the best looking anime ever created. But it's not just a pretty looking face. Akira has a great story too. It's an adaptation of Katsuhiro Otomo's Akira manga. You would think turning such a monster of a manga into one film would be impossible, but they've done a great job of condensing the story into a single piece of cinematography. The reason it was such a successful adaptation was because Otomo himself was in charge of the movie. No one knew the story of Akira more than he did, so he was able to pick and choose what and how the manga was adapted. Seriously, if you haven't seen Akira, go watch it straight after this video. It's an essential for anyone who calls himself an anime fan. Princess Mononoke is one of my favourite Ghibli films. Normally Ghibli repeat characters and themes, but Mononoke really pushed up the bar when it came out. It has a really interesting story about humans living with the land. The characters were all pretty well developed and I actually felt attached to them. The movie was animated to a very high standard, which is to be expected from Ghibli, but this movie in particular had excellent fluidity. Satoshi Kon is making it back onto the list with his recent movie, Paprika. Like the others I mentioned, Kon blurs the line that separates reality from fantasy. He tells a dreamlike story of a futuristic technology and the implications of that technology. Madhouse produced his movie again, and done a spectacular job. Paprika is a brilliant example of what modern animation can do, with super high quality detail and movement. The one movie that comes close to Akira's influence is Ghost in the Shell. If you've watched my videos for any amount of time, you know that I'm a huge fan of the sci-fi classic. There's little I can say to put this movie down. It was and still is one of the greatest pieces of animation. It's super smooth, the character designs are brilliant and iconic, and the backgrounds are breathtakingly detailed. Like Akira, Ghost in the Shell's influence surpasses Japan, and has had a huge impact on the Western film industry. The film has been noted as main inspirations for films like The Matrix. The characters are some of the best ever written, with great depth and outstanding development. The story, despite being set about 40 years in the future, is still one of the most accurate predictions of future life. Like Akira, this movie is unmissable for any self-proclaimed anime fan. Ninja Scrolls is another classic, although it didn't fare as well in the test of time than other films. Though it is still a great action film, the animation has a nice classic look, and although there are some quirks, it still looks great. Although a big focus of this movie is the action, the characters and story aren't neglected. The characters are all very enjoyable and get the viewer attached as the movie goes on. It's another important movie for the industry and one I would recommend anyone to watch. Ryujin Z was Katsuhiro Otomo's next project after Akira. He didn't direct the movie, but he wrote it, and wrote the manga. It's a very simple movie, but it's a very interesting one. It follows the short journey of a few characters as they tell a really touching story. It's a very interesting look into a possible future with a brilliant classic anime feel. Definitely worth checking out, especially if you're an Otomo fan. There are so many slice of life comedy school anime out these days, but none of them can compare to Great Teacher Onizuka. The anime clocks in at 43 episodes, and they're all worth watching. It's about an ex-gang member who lands a job teaching at school. I know it sounds like a generic premise, but it's not. GTO is full of the perfect mix between great comedy, really touching emotional moments, and everything in between. The show might be a little bit dated, but it's not lost any of its charm. So many anime try to add dark political themes to seem serious, but few do it as good as Jinro. In an alternative Japan where World War II had a different outcome, the country is plunged into a dark mess. Civilians protest while politicians turn a blind eye. Our story follows a soldier as he finds himself lost and confused in the situation. It's a dark but moving story about war and its effect on everybody. With stunning cinematography and immersive writing, this is one of my all-time favourite anime films. One of the most unique pieces of art I've ever experienced is Serial Experiments Lain. A very early Yoshitoshi Abe series, Lain is still today one of the most unique anime shows out there. Everything from its narrative style to its art direction is phenomenal. It's quite easily one of the best and boldest anime series out there, rivaled successfully by very few. Another classic is Berserk, an adaptation of the fantastic manga series of the same name. Berserk is one of the most powerful anime series of the decade. The animation hasn't aged that well over the years, but the gritty art style makes up for it completely. It tells a harsh story with brilliant characters, writing and tension. I definitely recommend this over the movie remakes. If you've not watched Cowboy Bebop, what have you been doing? Bebop is a fantastic show that has aged beautifully over the years, and has remained high on my list ever since I watched it. It's a fantastic blend of genres, directing styles and visual styles. It's also one of the most important shows of the decade for the Western industry. If you like Cowboy Bebop, then you'll also like Trigun. It's another episodic show that follows a similar set of characters. Again, it blends together genres to create a really unique show. It's not as hard-hitting as Bebop, but it does have its fair share of serious moments. Macross Plus is part of the Macross franchise, but it doesn't tie in as much as the other installments. It's a lot darker than the original series and focuses on a smaller set of characters. The story is very good, but it's the visuals that really leave an impact. It's a fantastic portrayal of a crazy sci-fi world. The animation alone is a good reason to watch this, but the story is fantastic too, with its emotional twists and great character interactions. Possibly one of the most talked about anime series ever, and for good reason. Evangelion was incredibly innovative for its time, and still is today. It almost single-handedly saved the industry and sparked a whole artistic movement of anime. These days its influence is hard to grasp, but the show's genius isn't as hard. It's an amazing mix of great written characters and a massive story. Having some of the most in-depth characters ever written bounce off each other is fantastic to watch. The series is something every single anime fan should watch before calling themselves an anime fan. It's a powerful experience regardless of your age and taste. If you spent any time on my channel, you've probably spent some time listening to me talk about Ghost in the Shell. It's one of the smartest movies ever made. It's a glorious mixture of some of the best written dialogue in anime and some of the best action. It mixes deep philosophical content with some awesome sci-fi action and world building. Another must-watch piece for anyone that wants to call themselves an anime fan. It hasn't aged at all since it was made 20 years ago, and will continue to remain one of the greatest pieces of Japanese animation.